Hello, and welcome to our panel discussion on the implications of South Africa's 2024 elections. I'm Evan Lieberman, professor of political science at MIT, where I direct the Center for International Studies, which is hosting today's event. We have a terrific panel lined up for you to help make sense of what was really a landmark election in the modern history of South Africa, one that comes in a year in which an unprecedented number of elections are being held all around the world. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank our co-sponsors, Africa MIT, Afrobarometer, and Good Governance Africa. I also want to mention that we'll have a time for Q&A at the end of the panel. If you haven't already, please find the Q&A feature on the bottom of your toolbar. This is where you can type in a question and we'll answer as many as possible, both online and in person. In addition, please pay attention to the chat feature, also on the bottom toolbar, where we'll be sending out resource links such as bios, upcoming events, and other information that may be of interest. All right, so now let me introduce to you our speakers. I'm just going to share a very brief bio, but please note that there will be a link to their full bios in the chat. Rorasang Lekalake is a senior analyst and methodologist for the Afrobarometer, which is the leading source of public opinion data in Africa. Rory received her PhD in political science from MIT in 2023 and has written extensively on South Africa. Lwanda Makwelane is a PhD candidate at Rhodes University and an early career research activist. Lwanda is currently a researcher at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. Daniel de Cat, another MIT political science PhD, is assistant professor at the London School of Economics, where he is also an affiliate of the Data Science Institute and a senior visiting fellow in government. Dan has written extensively on the electoral politics of South Africa. And finally, Pranish Desai is a senior data analyst at Good Governance Africa, which is a research and advocacy organization headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa. You may have seen Pranish recently quoted in the New York Times for his perspectives on the election, and he's an incoming doctoral student at MIT. So you may have noticed a pattern here. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to invite Rory to join me on our virtual stage. Hi, Rory.
Hi, Evan. Thanks so much for this opportunity to participate in today's discussion. So to provide a little bit of background for everyone today, Afrobarometer conducted a phone survey in the weeks leading up to the May 29 election to essentially gauge the temperature of the electorate. And essentially what we found is that the mood was quite gloomy. Specifically, we found really high levels of dissatisfaction across a wide range of economic, social, and political issues. In addition, our results suggest that these views are widespread across the population. So firstly, I guess to ask or answer what people were unhappy with, the short answer is we found that people were unhappy with almost everything that we asked about. Some key highlights from the survey include the fact that 85% of our respondents said that they felt that the country was going in the wrong direction. This really high level is very similar to what we found in 2022 when we did a face-to-face survey. And it represents a very significant increase since 2011, when just under half of South Africans shared the same view. We also found that voters were really expected more of the ANC-led government, with critical evaluations of the way it was handling economic issues such as job creation, social issues like crime, education, and basic service provision, and political issues such as reducing corruption. These concerns or critical evaluations are also very much reflected in the issues that the voters we spoke to were concerned about and feel that the incoming government should tackle. Unemployment was by far and away the leading priority that our respondents gave, and we found that that is historically the case and very much is unsurprising given the high levels of unemployment in the country, particularly among young South Africans. We also found a spike in the proportion of people who cited electricity as a major concern. And I think this is really also reflecting the reality on the ground, as in 2022, there was a record 332 days in which South Africans faced power cuts. In addition to that, like many other countries, South Africans are facing really high levels of inflation in the post COVID-19 world. And then we also found that dissatisfaction with these very specific areas in which the government is working seems to be spilling over into that with the broader political system. We found that people were very critical of the performance of specific leaders, including Cyril Ramaphosa, and they were also 62% also said that they were dissatisfied with the way that democracy is working in South Africa, and we find that a decreasing proportion of South Africans are saying that they believe that elections are a good way in which to hold leaders accountable. Our concern as an institution that is pro-democracy is that these very high and sustained dissatisfaction levels may eventually spill over into disillusionment with democracy as a system of government. Commitment to democracy over alternative systems, we found, is no longer the majority view in South Africa. However, it is the plurality view and was expressed by 47% of our phone samples. So we do think that there is hope, and it's not all gloom and doom, as long as these deficits that people are seeing in governance and in the political system start to be filled. In terms of who we might say were the most unhappy prior to the election, the short answer again is pretty much almost everyone that we spoke to. What we found is that dissatisfaction with the status quo appears to have been a unifying factor among South Africans. When we looked at these responses for most of the trends that I cited above, across demographics like gender, age, location, and education, we really found that there were very small differences in people's views. So a gloomy picture in terms of the status quo, but as you mentioned, this election is a watershed. It does provide a great opportunity for change in that, you know, we're looking at a coalition situation. So I do think that there's a lot to look forward to, and we plan to gauge the views of those same voters in our follow-up survey. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Rory. So Rory just gave us the picture. We wanted to understand, you know, what was going on in the minds of voters in the days, weeks, months, and actually years prior to this election, which was just held at the end of May. And she painted what all of us who study South Africa and have spent time there know was a pretty gloomy picture. Lwanda, thanks for joining me now. What I'm hoping you can share with us is giving us some insights into what were really the choices that voters had for the election. What you know, the ANC has been the ruling party since 1994. But what were the main options that voters had when they went into the voting booths? And, you know, did they have real choices? So can you tell us about these parties that were the main contenders competing for power in the election?
Thank you so much about that. I think before we can go into that, it would be important to really just position why voters actually deflected from the ANC. I mean, it's a host of issues that have been widely reported on, namely state capture, the Zondo Commission, and almost having 90% of ANC top officials being implicated in the state capture report. The corruption and looting that we have seen in state-owned entities. We also see a rise in service delivery. And the second one is service delivery protest, where we see really a grassroots response from communities responding to almost a regressive economy, where we are seeing almost 45% of the youth in the country unemployed. And this speaks to actually the ANC's inability to actually restructure rural economies, particularly speaking to provinces such as Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal that continues to be a contributing factor to mass local migration to main economic hubs in the country. I also think it's important for us when we look at these protests and we look at voter apathy or disinvestment into the ANC idea or the ideology of the party in and of itself, how municipalities across the country have performed that speaks to service delivery. The country has 257 municipalities. 64 of those municipalities are considered to be dysfunctional, which is rooted in poor governments, weak institutions, lack of capacity, poor financial management, and corruption. And then in a period of 2017 to 2022, we see a rise of 33 municipalities actually being put under administration, either through the Act of Parliament or that of provincial administration, depending on court orders. So that gives us a glimpse view why voters actually deflected from the ANC. And then we also see that with parties such as the EFF, COPE, and Umkhonto weSizwe, we see really a deflection from the party. This deflection has either been informed by ideological differences at some point in time, or has been really informed by big man politics and or patronage networks that have progressively weakened the ANC and its inability to reconcile those factional battles within it. So we see that key main policy positions, which are resolutions in terms of the party in and of itself, when we speak about radical economic transformation. I mean, to mention radical economic transformation in South Africa today some might hear it as a taboo saying, but radical economic transformation is actually a Congress resolution policy of the ANC. So you see parties like the EFF, you see parties of Umkhonto weSizwe, the recently formed Umkhonto weSizwe, actually speaking to those aspects of radical economic transformation. For example, you see the EFF is premised on the 7 cardinal pillars, and you find that the seven cardinal pillars of the EFF in and of itself are actually Congress resolutions of the ANC Youth League in 2011. So even when we speak about the ANC and the EFF and MK, you almost speak of the ANC in its different policy and ideological era in an evolution of time. And then you get to see that, in fact, when the voters or the electorate voted, they voted for the ANC in different times of its evolution. So I think that is very important for us to take note of. And then that's why that when the electorate also votes in terms of these 3 political parties, the issue of land becomes central. The issue of how we interpret the Freedom Charter, or how the Freedom Charter is also brought to the fore, becomes key in unpacking how the electorate is responding. We also have issues, I would say, not issues. There was also the Democratic Alliance. I think the Democratic Alliance is pro-market capitalist and also can speak to liberal. It's a liberal political party. But in 2019, we see almost a political rupture in its poor performance, and how it also brought back Helen Zille into the party, where under the banner or the card of internal transformation, premised on a party panel review report that was generated by Tony Leon and Ryan Rhodes, could see that the party was alienating its traditional voter base, which was the white Afrikaner-speaking voter, and blamed the party's disappointing performance in the 2019 general elections on its attempt to attract Black voters. So we almost see a more conservative DA come to the fore. But we also see almost an exodus of top senior Black leaders of the DA actually leave the DA, and in leaving the DA, they form parties such as Action SA by Herman Mashaba, Bosa by Musi Maimani, Xaluva by Bongani Baloyi, and Ghana Makashula joining Rise Mzansi. And all of these are actually offshoots of the DA. And you can see even in how they've gained votes in the country that some votes were actually taken from the DA party itself. So if we are to look what has happened in the country so far in terms of the coalition or the national government of unity, I think there's also some anxiety in the country as to, is this a beginning of a new dawn, or is this really a beginning of some sort of chaos in the country? Because if we look at it in terms of on the ideological spectrum in itself and policy, in terms of land, the policy on land expropriation without compensation, the policy position on affirmative action, the policy position on Black economic empowerment, free education, the nationalization of the healthcare system, the bit contested debate about nationalizing the reserve band, and some would argue maybe in some ways that the DA is pro the dissolution of the mining charter in and of itself, but also the conflicting and interest-based views on foreign policy in terms of the role of South Africa in BRICS, the position South Africa has taken in terms of Russia, the Ukraine war, and Israel's genocide on the people of Palestine. So it will be interesting going forward now that this national government of unity, which I understand it to be in all intents and purposes a coalition, how it navigates the space. Thank you.
Thanks, Lawanda. All right, so you got some picture of the political landscape with the various parties that were competing for power. There were a huge number, several hundred parties in this particular election that were competing. And as Lawanda points out, many of them were offshoots of existing parties from the ANC, from the DA, et cetera. I'm going to ask Dan to now join me, who is a specialist on voting behavior. Great to have you, Dan. So, tell us what happened from your vantage point. What happened on election day? We have these choices, lots of parties. We know that the ANC didn't get the over 50% wanted, but what do you see as the big headline stories from the election?
So thanks very much for having me, Evan. Let me start first by making one methodological point, because I'm apparently here representing data science, which is that everything we know about the election is based on aggregated data that we can see at the polling place level in South Africa. There's about 24,000 polling places. So it's actually quite hard to tell what voters did on the day and how they changed their behavior if they switched from one party to another, because we don't really get to see what voters did. We just get to see what groups of voters did together. So everything I'm going to tell you or suggest to you is based on what we call ecological inferences, sort of things we can learn from looking at data aggregated up. And we're going to have to wait for people to gather more surveys, people like Rory, to be able to learn exactly what happened at the voter level in the future. So I just want to start with that disclaimer for everyone. What I want to then do is just pick up what Lawanda was saying, which I think was a magnificent summary of how electoral politics and elite level politics in South Africa has shifted over the last 15 years, which is to say that as much as everybody is talking about this election as a watershed moment where everything has changed, and it has changed in some ways, in many ways, from an electoral politics perspective, everything has stayed the same. What's shifted, as Lawanda masterfully articulated, is that the elite politics of South Africa has changed. The ANC is finally split properly. The DA has all of these offshoots because it seems to fail to be able to retain elite Black political leaders, like the people Lawanda was referencing. And so what we saw in some ways in the electoral politics of the election was that people just kept doing what they've been doing for the last 15, 20, 30 years. We saw the same broad block of people supporting the ANC and now its offshoot MK. And to some degree, you could argue it's offshoot the EFF, though it's a slightly more contentious claim. We saw the same broad block of voters supporting the DA and some of the offshoots of the DA, the sort of liberal urban parties that are starting to form in Gauteng and other parts of the country. And in some ways, the big contours of electoral politics in South Africa have just stayed the same. There hasn't been a huge titanic shift, despite all the dissatisfaction that Rory articulated, which is very real and very acute, and those tuning in from South Africa will know that that's the case. There still hasn't been a titanic shift in the way that voters are perceiving politicians, such that voters are changing their behavior more than it is the case that elites are changing their alliances and carving up the electorate in different ways. So maybe that is a slightly depressing view of what's happened in this election, that perhaps this isn't as revolutionary or as big of a watershed moment as it might have been. But I think there are still some clues about how South Africa is changing and how voters are slowly changing. And the biggest one I'd point to is that in urban South Africa, especially in urban Gauteng, where the ANC has really had to try and firm up its support, and a lot of what it did with bringing Cyril Ramaphosa in after Jacob Zuma's decade in power was to try and firm up urban support in places like Gauteng. That seems to have softened quite dramatically in the election, both in places like Soweto, where you might expect that with the rise of MK, but also in parts of urban Gauteng, which are previously dominated by the DA, but the ANC was running in a close second. And that does give some clues and some worrying signs, I think, for the future of the ANC and whether it's going to be able to retain at least a plurality hold of power in South Africa as it has currently. The second primary thing I'd highlight is that we had quite a devastating drop once again in turnout in the election. And this continues a trend from the last 25 years, roughly, of voters being less and less formally engaged in politics in South Africa. They're still extremely engaged in politics informally, but formal engagement seems to have declined over the years. So we had a drop to about 58% of registered voters turning out to vote, which was about an 8 percentage point decline or 9 percentage point decline from the previous election. But really worryingly is that that's the number of people who voted amongst the registered population, but the registered population is growing at a decreasing rate. In other words, we are not registering as many people each cycle as we did in previous cycles. Given what we know about South Africa's age demographics, that's really troubling. And it suggests that the number of people who are actively involved in formal politics in South Africa is shrinking, essentially. And what we saw is that only about 40% of all voting age people in South Africa, 18 plus citizens, actually turned out to vote. Some of that might have been to do with all the incredibly long lines that were a result of seemingly underfunding of the IEC and some technological problems that they faced on election day. But the reality is most of that is probably about generational replacement, where an old active political base in South Africa is being replaced by young voters who simply aren't interested in formal politics, maybe for good reason, maybe for not so good reasons. But that is quite a scary picture, I think, for the future of electoral democracy in South Africa, that things are roughly seeming to stay the same, but the base of people who are participating keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, at least in terms of formal politics. The last thing I'll say is to end on a slightly more optimistic note, which is that one of the changes that happened in this election was that we introduced this third ballot, which was essentially an answer to a constitutional court decision about how about the rights of independent candidates to run for political office in South Africa. And this third ballot created some confusion, I think. There's quite strong evidence that there was a lot of what you would call in political science roll-off, which is that people were voting on the national ballot and on the provincial ballot, and then they were sort of not really voting at the same levels on the third ballot, the regional ballot. So we kind of saw a decline in the number of people actually casting that regional ballot. But what was optimistic is that we also, I think, see quite a bit of evidence, ecological inference concerns aside, that people are actually splitting their tickets, that people were supporting a party at the national level, but not supporting it at the local level, or vice versa. And you saw interesting patterns, I think, especially in relation to the DA, bringing back Luanda's point about the failure of the DA to be able to promote and retain elite Black political talent, that you saw stronger support for the DA at its local races, on the provincial ballot specifically, as compared to the national ballot, where voters are discriminating in regards to this party because of the fact, I would argue, that at the elite level, the DA hasn't really transformed itself particularly well, but at local levels, it's doing a slightly better job of doing that. And that, I think, is optimistic because it suggests serious sophistication in South Africa's political voting public, that they're sort of interested and can be persuaded to think very carefully about splitting their ballots and not just voting based on party lines.
Thanks, Dan. But before I let you go, one big picture question that we haven't answered. A lot of people who are joining us today know the results of the elections, and they your main headline was that things have stayed the same. But if we just look at the percentage of votes for parties, there were some big differences. Do you want to just quickly summarize those? Because let's face facts, this is the first election since 1994 when the ANC didn't have a big majority. So can you just set the stage for us? Because before we turn to a discussion of the coalition, people need to understand actually there were some really big changes in the voting outcome.
Sure. So the way I describe what's happened in this election is that everything has changed, but nothing is different. Everything has changed in that, as you rightfully said, for the last 30 years, South Africa has been led by a majority party that essentially in political science terms, we would talk about as a dominant party. The ANC has been able to do whatever it wants because it's had more than 50% of the seats in parliament. And in South Africa's parliamentary system, that gives it essentially power to do whatever it wants. There was a period where it could change the constitution by itself. And what happened in the election was that the ANC finally lost that majority, and in fact lost not just the majority, but it lost the full 17 percentage points at the polls. It went from about 57.5% of the seats in parliament to around 40% of the seats in parliament. And now because of South Africa's parliamentary system, even though we have a president, clearly named, that means that the ANC can no longer make decisions by itself. The ANC now has to rely on the support of opposition parties to be able to get more than 50% of votes in parliament and be able to do things like elect a president, which they've just done. The reason I say nothing has changed is because that difference, that 17 percentage point difference, most of it was captured by this new party, Umkhonto we Sizwe, as Luanda referred to, which is the party helmed by Jacob Zuma, the former ANC president and the former South African president. They got about 14.5 percentage points. There's a small difference there, which was distributed among some of these new parties like the PA and Action SA. But the sort of broad picture to me is that everything has changed because South African politics has now entered an entirely new period. It's entered a period now of coalitional politics where the ANC is no longer dominant and able to make decisions by itself. But nothing is different from the voters' perspective. Most voters in South Africa voted for the same people and the same ideas that they voted for 5 years ago. It's just that those ideas and people are now redispersed in political space, which is important. It's very important, but it's a different kind of change to the one that many people expected.
Thanks, Dan. So what the other panelists have been alluding to, and we're going to really get into now with Pranesh Desai, who I'm going to ask to join me, is this coalition, right? So this really big change in elite politics, with the ANC not for the first time getting a majority. Can you tell us, Pranesh, what comes next and what's already come next? And what's the nature of this emerging coalition? Others have already referred to it. We know it's this government of national unity, and tell us your thoughts on whether you think it can be successful.
Thanks, Evan, and it's great to be with everyone today. So I'll be focusing my comments on three aspects of your question. First, I'll provide a brief history of coalition in South Africa, then I'll discuss the emerging coalition that has come out in the post-election period. And then finally, I'll discuss whether it could prove a success or not briefly. So on the point about the brief history, coalitions have been a part of South Africa's form of government since 1994 in some other way, but they've become more prominent over the last decade as the ANC has experienced some declines in its popularity overall, and that's also led to greater party fragmentation within our political system. One of the highest profile coalitions that have emerged in South African politics over the last 10 years have been in some of our biggest cities, or metros as they're known. which are places like Johannesburg, Tshwane, and eThekwini, Durban. And these have experienced quite considerable instability during this period. To just take an example, Johannesburg, which is the largest city in terms of economic output in South Africa, has probably experienced around 6 to 7 distinct periods of municipal administration since 2016 alone. And Johannesburg, in addition to being the economic hub of South Africa, is also the media hub of South Africa. And naturally, when there's this level of instability in South Africa, one of South Africa's biggest cities, there's going to be anxiety about whether this local level instability can actually seep in at the national and provincial levels as well. Now, following the recent election, what was striking was that the ANC was very quick to accept the results of that election and the loss of majority, and they quickly initiated coalition discussions with other parties. Other parties like the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and the Inkatha Freedom Party, which has its base in KwaZulu-Natal province, were also quite quick in establishing their various negotiating teams and agendas. Now, after a preliminary series of talks, the ANC announced that it intended to form a government of national unity and was therefore extending invitations of engagement to all parties that had gained representation in Parliament or in the National Assembly in South Africa. Now, crucially, the GNU, as it's known, is a part of the ANC's political messaging post-election, as well as some of the parties that have joined it, precisely because it was the name that was given to the Mandela administration during the 1994 to 1999 period, although there were some ruptures in that initial 10-year period. But it's quite important to highlight that a core part of the ANC's messaging is this trying to harken back to the Mandela era. Now, although the emerging government is being termed a GNU bipartisan to the agreement, the core partners at the national and provincial level that the ANC have selected, the DA and the IFP, have essentially become this sort of multi-party coalition of sorts. Those are quite clearly the three main parties that are collaborating at this point in time. However, some smaller parties have recently joined the coalition in recent days. This is naturally an evolving thing. It's only 2.5 weeks or so since the election results were announced. Now, it's quite likely that the features of the final agreement, so for now they've just signed a sort of statement of intent, but it's quite likely that the final agreement will include roughly proportional distribution of executive and legislative powers in terms of what the parties gained in the 2024 election. They'll be focused on something known as sufficient consensus, which basically is the idea that if parties that have roughly 60% of representation in Parliament agree on a policy issue, then that more or less will settle the debate at the cabinet level. And then lastly, there'll be quite important the establishment of dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, the ANC have stated that they're leaving the door open for future participation by other parties like the EFF and MK, but it's unclear whether other GNU parties would agree to this, and it would also dilute the ANC's power within the actual agreement that has been formed right now. Now, concerning whether it can prove a success, there are basically two key metrics here. First, can it prove politically durable? As in, can the coalition last the full 5 years of the parliamentary term? And linked to that is, can it prove a government success? Because government stability is going to be critical for tackling some of South Africa's biggest challenges that everyone's alluded to so far, like the declining satisfaction levels in our political system, economic concerns like youth unemployment, unemployment more generally, lack of prosecution for people who are implicated in high-level corruption and crime as well. And in that regard, there are some encouraging signs about the potential durability and stability of this government. First, there has been a greater commitment by various parties to public transparency in negotiations, including an emphasis on the need to publish any agreements that are being struck. And that's been quite an uncommon thing so far in South African coalition politics, having publicly available agreements. And that might also reduce the incentives for parties to renege on agreements because they might face potential political backlash at the polls. Although we have to still see the evidence of that in a more systemic way. Then, whether inside or outside this emerging coalition, parties are recognizing the importance of political competition and accountability. So, like I said, the ANC and the DA were both very quick to accept the results and move quickly to negotiations. But equally as important, the fourth largest party, the EFF, have accepted the election results and also identified how maintaining a robust opposition outside of that coalition is necessary for embedding democratic competitiveness and norms within our political system. For now, MK is the exception because they haven't properly accepted the results of the election. And then finally, in terms of some promising signs, before I briefly get into some caveats, there are some ongoing legislative processes that hopefully will strengthen our political system in various ways. These include civil service reform, which is critical for ensuring stability over the long run, some potential electoral and political system reform that might entrench accountability into our system, and also some action on stabilizing coalitions at the local government level. However, there are still some concerning points. For example, KwaZulu-Natal, which accounts for around 20% of South Africa's total population, is historically the epicenter of political violence in South Africa. And political assassinations, especially local councils, have become slightly more prominent again over the last 5 to 10 years. There was a wave of unrest in July 2021 within that province, which caused quite significant loss of life, but also economic damage. And the quite fractured post-election balance of KwaZulu-Natal might, potentially lead to more instability and hopefully not violence, but it might move in that direction if the state is unable to adequately clamp down on any unrest that was ferment, especially by potential MK operatives. And then lastly, there will be an inevitable period of adjustment for both citizens and political parties during this coalitions era. Coalitions are likely to stay in South Africa, but South Africa's gotten quite used to this one-party government, as Dan was alluding to. And so both citizens and political parties will really change the way they engage with each other, both within and also outside of election cycles.
All right, thanks, Pranesh. I'll just note, if you could, your audio is a little bit hard to hear, so you might just check that real quick for us as we transition to a fuller discussion. But thank you so much, and I'm going to invite all the panelists to join me so we can chat amongst ourselves a little bit, and also to field some questions from the audience. But just bring us back to the big picture, which I'd like to do. We started with thinking about how people were thinking before they went to the polls. And again, the mood in South Africa, I spent the past 4 months there, just before the election, and people didn't have enough bad things to say about what was going on in South Africa. And as Roy pointed out, there's now been a few years of load shedding. There's been water disruptions, lots of problems, a lot of unemployment. People were really unhappy. We had this big, very large number of parties. Dan talked about the fact that a lot of people were voting for the same people, essentially. But I might challenge him and say, I know he's saying things are different. I would focus things are pretty different. It really matters that they voted for different parties, because even if they, if you wanted Jacob Zuma when he was at the head of the ANC, that's a really different vote than voting for a party that is totally at odds with the ANC. And there's a lot of electioneering going on, but we wound up with a much more fragmented, set of votes and party shares. And Pranesh is bringing us back to the fact that this government of national unity has been agreed upon. And I have to say that one of the things that I have found really interesting in reading the news and speaking with contacts in South Africa is there's a wave of optimism in the country at the moment, right? I mean, if you see the performance of the stock market, of the currency, general the commentary in a lot of news. I mean, we can all think about the reasons why things may go wrong, and absolutely, but there really is a great deal of goodwill around this current new government of national unity. So let me start with that and ask the other panelists: do you agree or disagree? Is there, in fact, is this a pretty optimistic moment that has this feel the way, after the South African Rugby World Cup, brought home a big win? Or am I getting the pulse wrong? Do you see people being pretty down? Who would like to take a crack at that?
I can go.
Great, Lwanda, thank you.
I don't think it's optimism at all. I truly believe it's a sense of anxious anxiety, because if we really look at how coalitions have performed at local government, we start to see that there is cause for concern. And I think to term what we are seeing currently in South Africa as a national government of unity would be a mistake, because we are then equating this moment to when we had the same national government of unity in 94. That national government of unity was premised on a political imperative to actually avoid a sense of civil war and in the country, and actually get us into a democratic transition. And the imperatives that are underpinning this national government of unity are not the same conditions. And we are dealing here with a majority ANC that needs other smaller parties, or if we look at the DA, look at the IFP, to give them the majority vote in government. But that still remains that they have the majority in terms of that coalition. If we look at, I want us to bring it back to local government and the performance of municipalities. In 2021, we had 61 hung municipalities, severely impacting service delivery. And also a key aspect or critique of that was that every party at one point or another was accused of lack of negotiating in good faith. And I think that needs to be imperative, because just before the eve of the election of the new president of the 7th administration, there goes Helen Zille, the head of the Federal Council, reminding Secretary General Fikile Mbalula that Section 24 of the agreed upon contract says that they cannot add parties without a 60% agreement or consensus among the coalition, and that process was not had. So that in and of itself should be a signifier that we actually might be in a process where South Africa is about to really get to reimagine how we engage in politics, especially the fact of voter apathy. As it was noted that we have a decline in youth in particular going to the polls. And we also have a decline in how we participate in our politics. You find that branch activity only is revived during elections. And I think we need a more engaged and rigorous electorate that will be able to interrogate policy. Because even with this coalition, we are not even sure what were the trade-offs to inform such an ideologically contradicting two parties coming together. What were the trade-offs? The ANC has not told its membership, nor has the DA. And I think in the next few months, we are about to see what those trade-offs actually are.
All right, thanks, Lwanda. That's really terrific, and I think you're absolutely right that if we use the local government coalitions as a basis for predicting future success, That's not a very pretty picture, because I agree with your assessment there. Absolutely. All right, Dan, you were going to chime in. Love to hear your.
Yeah. So I think at the end there, what Rhonda said was a very good summary of the point I was trying to make about how, even though everything has changed at the elite level, and now we have to go into the world of coalition politics, what hasn't changed is that there is still no programmatic politics in South Africa. There is still no clear sort of set of policy dimensions upon which voters are discriminating amongst parties in coherent ways. And part of that is because the ANC has been such a big tent party for so long. And so the ANC itself has always, while it's had its pillars that it likes to talk about, and it has a variety of sort of policy agendas that it will develop every 5 years, for the most part, it's never had a particularly coherent programmatic identity as a party. And sort of what we saw in this election was not what we had all imagined and hoped we would see, which was that South African voters suddenly develop a taste for programmatic politics and begin to define their political choices on the basis of the policies the parties will pursue. Instead, what we saw was essentially a realignment at the elite level, and then people following the leaders that they like. Now, I think the optimistic interpretation of this is to sort of step back from the machinery of coalition politics, which I agree is kind of terrifying, because we just don't know how it's going to work, because we are, I think, facing a party that has spent its entire existence as a political party, at least, never having to compromise with outside forces and being able to do everything itself, now forced to compromise. And when you saw Ramaphosa give his speech where he announced the GNU, which is just a cloak term for a coalition, it was very clear that he thought he was going to be able to set the terms, but the reality is that the ANC can't set the terms anymore. The ANC has to collaborate with other people. So setting that aside, I think what sort of suggests some optimism is that perhaps this fragmentation that we finally encountered, this real meaningful fragmentation, will allow parties to develop programmatic politics. It will allow what's left of the ANC to define itself more coherently, programmatically, and what's become of the rest of the ANC, whether it's Mkhonto weSizwe or the EFF, to continue to define themselves more programmatically too. And if that can happen, if we see a realignment at the elite level that's not just about individuals pulling blocks of voters with them, but about developing meaningful political party identities that are based around programmatic politics. And what I mean by that is policy agendas that meaningfully distinguish these different parties from one another. Maybe that is an optimistic future for South Africa, where voters finally have a menu of choices that they can discriminate in choosing from that menu, not just on the basis of region or identity or some of the ways that they have done that in the past.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'm going to turn to Rory and on this point, and then I want to turn to some of the questions that we have from the audience. So, Rory, over to you.
Thanks so much, Evan. So I'll keep it really brief and maybe make a little bit of a cop-out statement, but I think it's always very difficult to answer a question like yours because, some of us study politics, or do it as our work. So I very much share some of the optimism and concern that have been raised already. But I guess the real question is, what does the quote unquote ordinary South African think about all that? And right now, all we have is kind of anecdotal data from when I go and ask people as I'm walking around and engaging with people in services. And the sense I've gotten from that is just exhaustion. But I do agree that this is definitely an opportunity. We'll see what comes next. And, just as a little plug, we are doing a post-election wave of this survey. And this is one of the important issues that we'll have to look into, whether there is some sort of optimism, what people actually think about these coalitions, because I think I'm constantly surprised by how much I pay attention to politics and people are just like, what is this? So yeah, that's my quick response.
Thanks, Rory. All right, I'm gonna ask Pranesh to help us with. I see multiple questions about the BRICS. Right, this is the kind of informal group of countries which started as Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then it has included South Africa, and now an even wider group of countries. And I think the questions that have come from some of you in the audience is what are the implications of this new coalition government for South Africa's participation in the BRICS and the kind of broader international relations of South Africa following this election.
Thanks, Evan. Hope audio is getting better now. So I think that the coalition arrangement is still evolving. So one thing that's important to highlight is how the cabinet has not yet been announced by the president, the cabinet that is. But I would anticipate from what has been said and private discussions that the portfolio that relates to international relations will stay with an ANC person. And so I wouldn't expect to see too much deviation regarding South Africa's approach to the broader world out there. What might become more of an issue is potential internal tensions within that cabinet. If the and the ANC, for example, disagree with one another on a specific issue, within the backdrop of the status quo position, which is essentially what the ANC has been doing for 30 years or so. That would be my general expectation. My sense is that the GNU will be quite inwardly focused in terms of focusing on domestic South African issues and then focusing on the SADC region. And this concerned fundamentally with questions around great power condition or BRICS or that much.
Great, thanks, Pranesh. Another question that came out, I'm gonna pose two, and I'm gonna ask the panelists if they want to answer either one of them. One concerns ethnic voting, right? And I just saw, there's been some commentary in the newspaper today about, was support for the MK party really an expression of ethnic voting? It's obviously in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a large Zulu-based province. Lots of disagreements about whether that's the case or not the case, and how was there kind of ethnic-based voting evident in this election? And then a second unrelated question concerns the implications of this election and the government national unity for climate commitments. South Africa, from one perspective, is part of the global South, being adversely affected by the huge climate emergency, but it is also the case that it is not a particularly green country, burning a lot of coal and having a pretty big carbon footprint. So either of those questions for any of the panelists.
Again, I can talk a bit about the concept of ethnic voting, quote unquote. I will start by saying that concept in South Africa, I think, is a challenging one, ethnic voting, because what identity means in South Africa is very complicated. Identity cuts in many different ways. Obviously, race is a big determinant of a lot of things in South Africa, of people's socioeconomic standing, of their educational opportunities, and so on and so forth. But there are also multiple cleavages within quote unquote race groups as they were constructed by the apartheid regime, which still exists. And so those are both within the Black community and the white community and the colored community and the Indian community. There are these sort of different cleavages. And so ethnic voting, quote unquote, again, is a tricky concept. I think what's really being gotten at by this question is kind of two broad patterns that emerged. One is that obviously what happened with the rise of Mkhonto we Sizwe was that largely Zulu voters were following Jacob Zuma, the first Zulu president of the country and the first Zulu president of the ANC, when he sort of cleaved off from the ANC, but also that there was this rise in a couple of small parties that were clearly making identitarian claims. In other words, parties that were trying to center voters' identity and make that the primary pitch that they were trying to activate. So, for example, the Patriotic Alliance I think is the sort of the big one in the colored community. What I guess I would say is yes, those are that's roughly what happened. Yes, those identities played a really big part, but also those identities have always played a really big part. Those identities were not hidden. They weren't not part of South African electoral politics. They've just emerged as a cleavage between parties in a way that they previously existed as a cleavage within parties. And so I'm not sure that there is any evidence of a rise in ethnic voting, but there is perhaps some evidence of a realignment of elite structures around ethnic identities that is a little bit different, and perhaps a little bit could be concerning, because I don't think that is a particularly, it's not programmatic political identity. It's not people deciding sort of who to support on the basis of policies. That said, identity and policy are so intimately connected in South Africa because outcomes are so intimately connected to identity that it's really hard to say that people are voting purely based on identitarian terms and not based on the fact that their identity is intimately connected to their political success and their economic success as well.
Thanks, Dan. And I think Pranesh, you said you were going to chime in a bit on a question of climate politics and climate policy.
Thanks, Evan. So I think that's what's important is that there has been a renewed and greater focus on this by the South African government over the last 10 years. So I would expect to see some slight acceleration on this issue, partly because the crisis is getting worse. It's quite common to see a greater prevalence of natural disasters in many parts of South Africa. And that is highlighting these sorts of problems. It is emphasizing how these problems affect local communities as well. So I'd expect to see the current trend towards more renewable energy sources for example, energy generation play a role in South Africa's overall mix around power generation because of the ongoing crisis around electricity generation. And more broadly, perhaps a continued commitment and main commitment to international best practices of these issue, but also a greater engagement with the multilateral organizations and the region of SADC itself on these sorts of concerns. I'd expect that just to rise as an agenda point, not necessarily because of a training, but because it is becoming a more salient issue itself.
Great, thank you. Well, I see that the time of 1 o'clock is about to strike. And I really am grateful to all the panelists for sharing your really considered thoughts and insights about this election and the implications with us. It's certainly an interesting time in South Africa for those of us who are looking at an election in November here in the United States. It provides some food for thought for different ways in which electoral politics get organized and play themselves out. I will say it's been interesting, at the very least in South Africa. For the most part, we've seen people say that they accept the results as valid, but that there's certainly some who are trying to be spoilers and challenging it. And that's a theme we'll be watching in elections around the world. Again, I really want to thank all of our panelists, thank our co-sponsors, and all of you for attending, and hope you'll continue to follow events that we sponsor with CIS. There's a link in the chat if you want to sign up and continue to participate and join us. So thank you so much. Have a great day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.